When Kim Jong-un stated earlier this year that he would define South Korea as the #1 imperialist nation, did he recall that afternoon 6 years ago when he held Moon Jae-in's hand and crossed the border between North and South Korea? Currently, tensions between the two Koreas are at an all-time high, and the smell of gunpowder is thicker than at any moment since the armistice of the Korean War. Why, after nearly a century of independence, do peace and unification still seem so elusive for the peninsula? The root cause is not just the game of guardianship. In reality, the North and South have long drifted apart. Strictly speaking, the Korean War has never fully ended because in the past, unification on the peninsula was always seen as the ultimate peace. In 1953, after being exhausted by the Korean War, the Americans were finally willing to come to the negotiating table to resolve the Korean issue. However, ending the war without a decisive victory not only meant the U.S. had to admit its own failure, but it also meant the Korean Peninsula would be split into two countries. Thus, on July 27th of that year, representatives from China, the U.S., and North Korea signed not a peace agreement, but an armistice awaiting a final peaceful resolution. The most important part of this armistice was that both sides would withdraw and establish a demilitarized zone, DMZ. To effectively achieve peace, the duration of the agreement was set to be indefinite. However, the South Korean government, under Syngman Rhee at the time, did not sign the armistice, and their compliance was merely due to U.S. pressure. As a result, the agreement only halted full-scale war between North and South, but did not address the issue of unification or eliminate the skirmishes that continued along the front lines. After the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed, the major powers involved could extricate themselves from the conflict. However, the friction between North and South Korea never ceased. Both sides have unilaterally declared at various points that they were no longer bound by the agreement, because, to them, announcing a cessation of hostilities before unification would imply an acceptance of national division, something neither side was willing to bear. Therefore, both have continued to provoke conflicts along the border to prove their commitment to unification. In reality, since the end of the Korean War, neither side has completely given up on peace. Both North and South Korea have proposed their own unification plans, but none of these have materialized. One extremely important reason is that the post-war leadership in South Korea, seeking to maintain their own positions, was practically forced onto a path of rapid development. Germany succeeded in unifying at the end of the Cold War, not only because of Gorbachev's tacit approval, but also because, while West Germany had surpassed East Germany overall, the economic gap between the two was not that large. This similarity in economic foundations allowed the formerly divided people to understand each other. However, on the Korean Peninsula, this economic similarity was lost due to South Korea's economic boom. The GDP per capita gap between North and South Korea is now tenfold. In the past, the Korean Peninsula was not only more uniformly developed, but the North also had a higher per capita output. However, everything changed when Park Chung-hee came to power. This famous South Korean dictator established the Third Republic, a regime infamous for its legal overreach. Park himself was a former officer in the Imperial Japanese Army and seized power through a military coup, an unsavory method. From the day he took office, South Koreans have voiced opposition to him. Though the military regime could suppress dissent for a time, the only way for an illegitimate government to maintain long-term control was to improve the people's standard of living and prove itself capable of governing. Park, understanding this, decided to prioritize economic development after coming to power. He was willing to compromise in any way necessary, even selling out the sovereignty and interests of South Korea and treating its people as mere resources, as long as it boosted the economy. Any obstacles to economic growth were ruthlessly dealt with. Although Park made many enemies, ultimately dying in 1979 in an assassination, he did lay an incredibly strong foundation for South Korea's economy through the sacrifice of an entire generation. In 1974, South Korea's GDP per capita surpassed that of North Korea for the first time. By 1979, South Korea's GDP per capita had reached $1,720, nearly 3 times that of North Korea's $625. Given that South Korea's population had long been double that of North Korea's, the two countries were no longer on the same economic level. But this was only the beginning. After Park's death, South Koreans did not experience the democracy they longed for. Chun Doo-hwan, also a former military man, took power through a series of coups and became president. His Fifth Republic, much like Park's Third Republic, suffered from low legitimacy. Throughout his 13 years in power, followed by his ally Roh Tae-woo, South Korea's leadership was either busy suppressing domestic democratic movements or fully focused on economic development. History proved that treating the populace like beasts of burden can indeed boost GDP. while both Chun and Ro ultimately ended up in prison during the 12 years that they governed South Korea. By driving its people hard, the country's per capita GDP increased nearly eightfold, aided by rapid economic growth and favorable exchange rate fluctuations. In 1995, both Chun Doo-hwan and Ro Tae-woo faced prison time due to massive corruption. But that same year, South Korea's GDP per capita soared to $12,680, 51 times higher than that of North Korea, which was enduring the hardships of the arduous march after the end of the Cold War. When considering total GDP, South Korea had already widened the gap between itself and North Korea by 2 full magnitudes. The lives of ordinary people in the North and South were now worlds apart, with differences spanning several generations. This extreme economic disparity created 2 completely different worlds on the Korean Peninsula by the 1980s. Even though North and South Koreans are still the same ethnic group by blood, when a North Korean and a South Korean sit together, even though they speak the same language, they wouldn't know where to start a conversation. Even if unification were to suddenly occur today, the gap caused by the extreme economic disparity between the North and South would not be resolved in just 1 or 2 generations. However, economic factors are not the only obstacle to Korean reunification. As the gap between North and South has continued to widen, the North's unwillingness to lay down its arms for self-preservation has become another major barrier to unification. After the Cold War ended, most countries on the front lines of the East-West confrontation chose to disarm and stand down. Yet both North and South Korea continue to live in a state of quasi-military mobilization. In South Korea, a country with a population ranked only 27th globally, it still boasts the 9th largest military in the world by personnel. In the North, the situation is even more extreme. North Korea's total population is only 25 million, but its active military force numbers over 1.3 million, ranking 5th globally. Both nations are aware that disarmament would benefit their citizens, but both maintain near-war levels of military readiness. At the heart of the issue is the North's position, where backing down now is not an option. Although the Korean War was paused in 1953, the North has never wavered in its resolve to unify the peninsula. Fundamentally, the founding of South Korea, led by Syngman Rhee with U.S. support, defied the will of the Korean people, and the North's military has always claimed the moral high ground in its desire to reunify the peninsula by force. After the armistice, the North didn't decrease its military forces. Rather, it actively sought to model itself after the Soviet Union, purchasing vast amounts of Soviet equipment and organizing its military to Soviet standards. The North hoped that with a miniaturized steel torrent, it could swiftly reunify the peninsula in the next war. This approach kept North Korea's military spending at an extraordinarily high percentage of its GDP during the Cold War, severely slowing its economic development. However, North Korea's hopes for a military-driven unification of the peninsula rested on one crucial condition. In the event of another war, it needed a powerful backer to prevent U.S. military intervention. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea lost not only cheap Soviet aid, but also any realistic hope of unifying the peninsula through military means. The North Korean regime's legitimacy is built on the pursuit of unification. If, after the Cold War, it had chosen to disarm and focus on economic development, regardless of how successful that effort might have been, Kim Jong-il, who took power in 1994, would have fared no better than South Korea's Park Chung-hee. Therefore, Kim Jong-il, unable to retreat, not only refrained from reducing military support, but also introduced the policy of military-first politics. During his rule, the number of personnel in the Korean People's Army surpassed 1 million. Simultaneously, in order to strengthen the country, both the aging Kim Il-sung and the newly succeeded Kim Jong-il secretly initiated nuclear weapons research under the banner of the North-South Denuclearization Declaration, and eventually turned the North Korean nuclear issue into a major geopolitical crisis in Northeast Asia. The North's bottomless investment in its military has resulted in a force far beyond the size that its economy should be able to support. However, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the real mission of the North Korean military has shifted from achieving unification of the peninsula to preserving the North Korean regime. Any reduction in the military would be a direct threat to the regime's stability. Yet without reducing military spending, North Korea's economic takeoff is an impossible task. This stalemate is the direct reason why reunification remains out of reach today. The Panmunjom Declaration signed by Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in was the last attempt to break this deadlock. But as South Koreans themselves have said, none of South Korea's issues can be separated from the U.S. Until the Americans, the ultimate power brokers, truly step back, neither peace nor unification will come to the Korean Peninsula.